to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today, we're going to be touching base and talking about a lot of hot topics of places that are really undergoing tremendous stress around the world. Two in particular are the Gaza Strip and Ukraine. My guest today is an expert on these topics. My guest is Dr. Robert Farley. Dr. Farley has taught security and diplomacy courses at the Patterson School of Diplomacy and Commerce at the University of Kentucky since 2005. Dr. Farley is the author of Grounded, The Case for Abolishing the United States Air Force, and Patents for Power, Intellectual Property Law, and the Diffusion of Military Technology. Dr. Robert Farley, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
It is always an honor to be here.
Thank you. I really appreciate you being with me today. We'll take the hardest one first. Let's jump right into it. The situation in Gaza is an absolute disaster. I don't think anybody thinks all is going well with any of the sides over there. How do you view that situation right now, and what can be done, if anything at all, to try to help bring stability to the area and to a cessation of the fighting?
So, as you suggest, it's a really difficult situation right now. There's a dreadful humanitarian crisis in Gaza that has largely been caused by the Israeli offensive. That offensive, of course, was triggered by the attacks of October 7th, which were launched by Hamas against Israel. It's a very bad situation right now. It's a very bad situation because Israel has inflicted extraordinary damage upon sort of the structures and infrastructure of civilian life in Gaza. And so even if we could come up with some sort of notion for a ceasefire at this point, the destruction which has been inflicted, both in human terms, in terms of people who've already died, but also in terms of just the physical structure of Gaza, is difficult to imagine how that's going to be replaced. Neither side has evinced an extraordinary determination to stop fighting at this point. Both Israel and Hamas have proposed ceasefires of various stripes, but generally on terms which they knew were going to be unacceptable to the other side. The really worrisome thing right now is that the Israelis appear to be planning an offensive directed at the refugee camps near the Rafah crossing, where there have been many Palestinian refugees who have taken shelter. President Biden seems to be suggesting and urging restraint, but we have a very difficult situation, and it's hard to see how we're going to get out of it.
We certainly do, and a lot of the observers believe that the U.S. has always said it wanted to be a neutral broker, which has never been, I don't think, it up to this point, and never will be in all probability. But the United States is in a tough spot, because if President Biden weren't supportive of Netanyahu, a lot of people believe that what would have happened would have been that Bibi Netanyahu would have flattened Gaza the first couple of days, whereas at least the U.S. can apply some soft power pressure to try to hold down on the fighting, or maybe to slow Israel down as far as the destruction that's taking place. How do you view that?
Well, again, that's a really tough question. So I think that, we don't know what the situation would look like if Biden had tried to exert full restraint upon Netanyahu. I think we have a much better sense of what Netanyahu's political calculus looks like. And he knows very well that he is going to be tossed out on his ear by the Israeli public as soon as this war is over. And so for him, that's it, right? This is his last public policy event, that he gets to try to win this war, or he doesn't. And then he's pretty much done, because, many Israelis correctly view him as the source of the policy that allowed the 10/7 attacks to be so successful, right? That he not quite supported, but he definitely amplified Hamas. He had the Fortress Israel strategy around Gaza that sort of assumed that Hamas would never try to break out. So he's in a tough spot, and he's decided to solve that problem with violence. President Biden's also in a tough spot. Even if the consideration wasn't just trying to get the Israelis to stop, he has important domestic headwinds, because the United States is unusual in that Muslims and Jews are largely in the same political coalition. And so really, whatever solution President Biden arrives at, he threatens to alienate part of his coalition. And so I think that that has, especially in election year, really structured how he's approached the problem as well.
Do you think the United States should take a different stance as far as the role at the United Nations, especially in the Security Council? The U.S. has basically defended Israel just about every time that any resolution, anti-Israeli resolution, came up in the Security Council. Should the U.S. maybe step back from that and maybe just abstain, not veto a resolution? Or maybe should the Palestinian state, which is being recognized each day by more and more countries around the world, should it become a member of the United Nations General Assembly?
Well, I mean, Palestinians already have certain rights at the United Nations, and the General Assembly is sort of a really small voice. But I think that people who, sort of the position of Israel at the United Nations is a complicated one. The Israelis will say, not without some cause, that they are sometimes unfairly treated by the General Assembly. That said, in this particular situation, as you suggest, I'm not sure how much is served by the United States applying its veto rather than an abstention, especially to General Assembly and Human Rights Council and other sorts of resolutions, which are simply condemning Israel rather than calling for some particular intervention, right? The Security Council might be a different situation, right? But in General Assembly and elsewhere, when the United States decides to oppose any kind of condemnation of Israel, it does seem like the United States is leaning to one side in an unnecessary way. And that's symbolic, but at this point, I think, we need to take symbolic politics seriously. And so the answer is, yeah, I think that the United States probably should revise its approach at the United Nations, at least towards symbolic condemnations of Israel, as opposed to sort of more serious measures that might come out of the Security Council.
Over the years, well, I think back to the Taiwanese, the Palestinians, both of those have for years wanted to get involved in the United Nations agencies. And of course, China has kept Taiwan out. And of course, there's been not a lot of support maybe for the Palestinians to get in, but they did join UNESCO a few years ago, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. And of course, the U.S. cut funding to UNESCO. We have now reinstalled that funding, but it's viewed as a diplomatic victory to be involved in the United Nations system, is it not?
Yeah, I think so, absolutely. And Palestinian policy and Palestinian politics, at least on the Fatah side, or at least on the Palestinian administration side, has always taken those kinds of symbolic victories seriously. They've always been something that have been considered sort of a worthy end for Palestinians to pursue. On the other hand, I'm not sure how much Hamas cares about any of that, right? And that, I think, brings us back to one of our formal or fundamental problems in this conflict, which is that the Israelis may be a single unit, but the Palestinians most certainly are not. One of the sources of this conflict is that Hamas and the Palestinian administration, Palestinian Authority, have much different understandings about what the future of relations with Israel should look like. And I don't think Hamas cares that much about UN recognition, right? They're not as interested in winning those symbolic victories.
That's probably very true. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or a community access television station or an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer, you like our shows and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at least two of the major hotspots in the world, and that's the Gaza Strip and Ukraine. My guest is a expert on both these topics. Dr. Robert Farley has taught security and diplomacy courses at the Patterson School of Diplomacy and Commerce at the University of Kentucky since 2005. Dr. Farley, we were talking about Gaza. Maybe we can shift gears and go to Ukraine at this point. There's been a tremendous battle raging on another battle, I should say, raging on Capitol Hill, where you have a large, I don't say a large part, but a significant, powerful part of the Republican Party who's opposed funding to Ukraine. And there are some Republicans who do want to continue the funding, and most of the Democrats seem to want to continue. So how do you view that? Should we, what Donald Trump and Putin want us to do right now, pull the plug on Ukraine and walk away from it and let Russia take it over? Or should we continue our funding, realizing that probably Zelensky and the Ukrainians will never achieve their total goals of securing all the land that Russia has taken? How do you view that?
So it's a great question. Well, first, I want to say that the United States is not the only country in the world supporting Ukraine. France, Germany, the United Kingdom, and Poland are all significant and important backers of the Ukrainian war effort. They have been primarily around making sure that they have oriented their action primarily around making sure that the Ukrainian economy will not collapse. And so the Ukrainian economy is actually in pretty good shape in terms of sort of its consumer economy. You still have functioning storefronts. You still have full supermarkets and so forth. They've also been important in military support, right? And so even though the United States has been limited in the amount of support that's been able to send for the last few months, the Europeans have stepped up with at least some of that. My own view is that, as of a year and a half ago, the Republican Party was very nearly unified in support of Ukraine. That Republicans in Congress have largely, many of them, a percentage of them have shifted their attitudes as it became more and more clear that former President Trump was going to win the nomination. And they're a little bit afraid of Trump. Some of them are a lot afraid of Trump. And so what we're seeing here is this ideological conflict within the Republican Party between sort of traditional Reaganite hawks on the one side and, President Trump, who is a little bit more friendly to authoritarians in places like Hungary, authoritarians in places like Russia, and definitely doesn't seem to value Ukrainian independence at all. I think the November election is going to be huge for the future of this war. It really will sort of depend, and I think both sides, both the Russians and the Ukrainians, are watching it very closely to see what will happen.
If we think back prior to the Russian invasion, almost 2 years now, I guess, of Ukraine, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was sort of floundering around, really wasn't sure what its mission was, its purpose. Some folks were talking about, well, do we really need NATO? Russia invaded Ukraine. President Biden pulled NATO together, along with some other folks too, in creating this viable force against the Russians. But now we're back in this discussion of whether do we really need a NATO, a North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In fact, just 2 days ago, former President Trump commented on how he would probably pull the U.S. out of NATO, and if that happens, NATO would collapse, I would imagine. So how important is NATO? Do we need to continue it? Do you see a restructured NATO, or how do you view that?
So I think it's an open question as to what would happen with NATO if the United States pulled out. I don't actually think it would collapse. I think, possibly in some ways it might become even more important to the Europeans, right? Because NATO is a way of aggregating military force. For a long time, that has been geared towards Russia. There was a period that it wasn't, but now it's most definitely geared again towards the Russians. You have to, and I think President Trump has actually pointed this out too, right? The Europeans are not poor people, right? Germany, France, the United Kingdom all have economies. Italy all have economies which are larger than the Russian economy. And so to the extent that NATO or a militarized European Union, which would play the same role, sits as a military balance to Russia, I think it's going to be necessary whether the United States is there or not. President Trump, I don't fundamentally think really understands NATO. He talks about it like it's a protection racket, a protection organization. what he would be able to do in a second term is an open question, because what he found in his first term is that it's really quite difficult for the president to do some things when both the executive branch and the legislative branch are against. And I don't sense that there is a lot of appetite, even among Trump's fans in Congress, for removing the United States from NATO or trying to bring the organization down. So, you know, we're looking at some pretty poisonous politics happening past November if President Trump gets reelected.
We certainly are, yes. Some of the foreign policy experts that I've talked to and heard from and that type of thing believe that if we do pull out of NATO, that we are on the fast track to World War III. And of course, we remember where the only two really major wars in the world took place in Europe, and we certainly don't want to bumble into World War III. But it's a very sensitive topic, and it's one that we need more discussion. And you're right, former president has not expressed a tremendous knowledge on what NATO does or many other international foreign policies in some respects. Some he does, but so many he does not. Well, as we look at the world today and all the weaknesses and strengths and that type of thing, there's one other problem that I'm going to try to squeeze in here before we get to the Space Force, is these attacks on democracy. We see it happening in Hungary. We see it happening in the United States. Democracies are under siege in many areas of the world. People are talking about setting up dictatorships, fascist police states, that type of thing. How do you view this? How important is it to have a democracy, or should we have a hybrid of that and some other type of operation? Or a lot of people argue that one reason the United States has been so successful is because we have a republic with the democratic system. How do you perceive that?
Well, I think democracy is great, and I think the United States should do its best to try to maintain its democracy. You know, I think one of the important reasons that a lot of people are really energized and have been energized about this fight in Ukraine is that it's a fight between democracy and autocracy. Ukraine is a fledgling, in some ways flawed democracy, and Russia is an autocratic state. It's not a totalitarian state, but it's an autocratic state. You know, it's very interesting, and especially to think about in the context of the presidential election. You know, foreign dictators prefer the idea of negotiating with Donald Trump to negotiating with Joe Biden, because Donald Trump, and he did this with Xi Jinping, and he did this with Kim Jong-un and with President Putin, is a very transactional politician, right? And so he will sit down with a dictator and they will come to a deal, right? Whereas President Biden and President Obama before him brought what a lot of authoritarians view as a lot of baggage, right? Liberal democratic baggage and international system global baggage that really constrained what they were going to do. And so I think Putin and Xi Jinping and so forth would love to sit down with Trump and say, let's make a deal. Like, let's make a deal over Ukraine. Let's make a deal over South Korea. Let's make a deal over Taiwan in a way that they don't feel they can do with Biden or someone like Obama.
And the on the street thinking with foreign policy experts, a large number of them believe that that's exactly what they want. They want to sit down and carve up the world. And of course, Mr. Trump says he could end the war in one day. Of course he would. He would give Ukraine to Russia. We all know how that's going to work out. But the interesting thing, it just crossed my mind as you were talking, that I've heard so many people in the past, and this started 6-7 years ago, from Republican former Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, several other prominent Republicans, Democrats have always been curious, sort of scratching their heads as to why Donald Trump is so buddy-buddy and cozies up to a dictator like Vladimir Putin. Have you heard, you've talked to a lot of high-level people, military experts. What do you hear on this? Do you hear that Putin has something on him? He's blackmailing him, or Trump's on his payroll? Or I've heard all different types of excuses or reasons for this, but it just crossed my mind that this is something that's going to get quite a bit of scrutiny, I think, as we go over the next 9 months. But do you have any inside information on it? Let's put it like that.
No, I mean, no, I don't have any inside information, and frankly, in the end, I kind of doubt that Putin has um, sort of any kind of special intelligence about Trump. I think that the interests here are basically ideological. That President Trump, believes in having a strong executive position. He's not a politician, right? He is a CEO of a family company where he could do anything he wanted, anytime he wanted. And so the authoritarian mindset or the authoritarian approach comes kind of naturally to him. And I think especially with President Putin, right? President Putin has tried very hard to stake out a position on the global right wing, right? Sort of very traditionalist, anti-woke, right? Anti-feminist, right? And all of these are things I think that
Anti-gay, right?
anti-gay, right? These are things that appeal ideologically to President Trump. And so I don't think you need to search around for an explanation here. I think that President Trump views President Putin as an admirable figure. That's one of the reasons that he's willing to default to a lot of President Putin's preferences.
Certainly is, no doubt about that. Well, one decision that President Trump made when he was president, he created the Space Force. What exactly is the Space Force? What does it do? What is its function?
So the Space Force is an independent military service, just like the Army, the Marine Corps, the Navy, the Air Force, but it is within the Department of the Air Force. And so in that sense, it's quite similar to the Marine Corps, which is an independent military service, but which is within the Department of the Navy. And the Space Force is a very small service. It's only around 20,000 personnel right now, but it is essentially tasked with all of the work that the United States military has to do in space, right? And so this is primarily stuff around reconnaissance and communications, some intelligence gathering, but that's pretty much what the Space Force does. And it's been around since 2019. It got going slowly because of COVID, but President Biden did not fold it back into the Air Force when he might have had the chance early in his term. And so it looks like the Space Force is here to stay, at least for a little while. And it's opened up a lot of questions about, okay, well, if we have the Space Force, what else do we need, right? Do we need a cyber force? How exactly do we organize our military in order to most efficiently face the national security challenges? And I think a lot of people are saying, well, whatever the most efficient way is, it probably shouldn't involve Space Force. But that's kind of where we are right now. And those are kind of, the die has been cast on the future existence of Space Force, I think.
Exactly right. I remember when the comedian Stephen Colbert, he did a field trip to their headquarters. I think it's in Greenland, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct? Greenland or Iceland, one of the two. And
I think it's
it was
Colorado, actually. There was probably a base or something in Greenland or Iceland.
well, that was what it was, yeah. But he talked to the commandant and a variety of other folks. But it was an extremely interesting interview. If anybody would like to pick that up. Now, you wrote the book, The Case for Abolishing the United States Air Force. What was your basic premise on that with that book?
Yeah, my basic premise, my basic idea was that the Air Force created a lot of external and unnecessary bureaucracy, that we would do better by maintaining the capabilities that the Air Force had, but keeping them within the Army or putting them back into the Army, putting some of the capabilities into the Navy. In the ensuing year, so the book is 10 years old, in the ensuing period, not only has the Air Force not been abolished, but we've decided to go the other direction,
All
which is
right.
we've split the Air Force in two. So now we even have more bureaucracy than we did at the beginning. So
Solomonic decision. That's quite right. Yeah. Well, that's very, very true. That brings into question, though, the Defense Department budget. Anytime we talk about any of the branches, and we've seen that there's so much overrun and waste, fraud, and abuse in some of these programs. One that gets most of the attention, or did for a while, was the F-35 fighter jet. And they're already, what, $1 trillion over or something like that. And the thing, as I understand it, according to the aeronautical engineers, this thing cannot even fly near a thunderstorm without maybe some of the equipment being defunct or something. What can we do about that? We have to have a strong defense. I think we're all in agreement on that. But how can we get the best bang for our buck and to make sure we don't have as much waste, fraud, and abuse? Do we need more competition? There are only about, 6 or 8 aerospace companies now that are competing against each other in the military field. What can be done to tighten this up? Because as you've probably seen that the study that was done by the Government Accountability Office years ago, several of them, that showed that every 20 or 25 cents on the dollar that went to the Defense Department was wasted. But what can we do to tighten that up and to make it more efficient, and so the taxpayers get money's worth?
So, it's not going to surprise you to say that we can't answer this question in 90 seconds.
Right.
Now, here's where the counterintuitive part it comes in, and this is what Department of Defense people will tell you. And sort of living within a university bureaucracy that operates in the same way, what DoD people will say is that there is a tremendous amount of the fraud and waste in the Department of Defense that has been generated by Congress in congressional oversight. Right. And so the rules that Congress has installed in order to attempt to reduce fraud and waste have actually created this gigantic oversight bureaucracy and mandated that the Department of Defense has to act in a particular way with respect to how it does contracts and how it builds out programs. And that oversight is in and of itself extremely wasteful, right? And the phrase that somebody told me was that you in government, you can waste as much money as you want in this purpose of preventing people from wasting money, right? So as long as you say I'm stopping fraud and waste, you can fraudulently waste as much money as you want. And so, if we had more time, I would tell you a little bit more about the F-35 and how it's actually now being considered kind of a
We'll
success.
pick that up in the next interview for sure. I mean, Dr. Robert Farley, you always have such a unique insight into these issues. That's why I love having you on the show. And I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.